Scripture lesson for today. It's from the book of Hebrews, the 9th chapter, if you'd like to follow along. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that's not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Let's begin today by talking about an interesting letter that well-known pastor and author Wes Tracy received a while back. Let me read just a part of it to you. It reads, "I have hundreds of biblical photographs, including several of the Garden of Eden." Well, Tracy says in response, I myself, I have seen and I have taken literally thousands of biblical pictures, tiny mustard seeds up on the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mounts and the Lord's supposed birthplace guarded by the soldier with an automatic weapon in Bethlehem. But Eden? Did they have cameras in the Garden of Eden? Just exactly where was Eden anyway, he says. And though a headline in a supermarket tabloid might say, "Adam and Eve's skeletons found south of Denver," I can assure you that Eden was not in Colorado. So, where was Eden? So one day, Dr. Tracy, he has this college freshman come to him and ask the same question. "Doctor, could you tell me where exactly was Eden?" Tracy says, he put down his pen, he turned to the college freshman, and he said, "I can tell you exactly where Eden is. It's in Tennessee." And the student said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, Knoxville, Tennessee, 215 South Elm Street. It was there on Elm Street back when I was a boy that I stole a quarter out of my mom's purse, and I ran to the store and I bought this bag of peanut clusters and I ate it as quickly as I could, and afterwards I was so ashamed that I came back home and I crawled in my closet and I hid, and my mom, she came looking for me and she found me and she said to me, 'Wesley, why are you hiding? What have you done?'" And he finishes by saying, "Need any help locating your own Eden? That place where you first betrayed the noble, the good God? Well, that's the place. Your Eden was that situation in which you discovered that you suffer from a curvature of the soul. It's called original sin." Well, we have folks who are considering baptism next Sunday morning down there in Lake Michigan. And seeing as how baptism is about dealing with this whole curvature of the soul problem, with original sin, of being washed clean from that stain and then left with a watermark. Let's recall that for the Jews of the Old Testament, their mark in the flesh from the covenant was what? It was circumcision. But for us as Christians, our mark in the flesh is through what? Baptism. We have a watermark on us. If you've ever bought fine stationery, then you know the maker of that stationery, they put a watermark on it to signify its maker. So God has made us as believers so that when we go down into the waters of baptism, we come up with a mark on us. And that mark, it says to the world, it says to the devil as well, that we are his. That we go down into the water, we are buried, we die, and then we are resurrected. We are regenerated. We are made into a new creature. Or perhaps, let's say next Sunday, somebody comes and they want to rededicate their faith. Maybe at some point in their life along the faith trail, you know, their faith just sort of grew old and it sort of grew stale. And yet, when we're baptized, as I like to say, we're supposed to walk wet. Our faith is supposed to stay vital and alive. It's not supposed to dry out. You know, I think that we can't fully appreciate the deeper meaning of the Christian faith if we are not familiar with the entire biblical drama. That from the very beginning, there in the Garden of Eden, before sin sort of spoiled it all, wherever the Garden of Eden was, that Adam and Eve, they enjoyed this sort of idyllic, carefree existence. And then all the way from there in the beginning to this prison colony was called the Isle of Patmos. It's at the end of our Bibles. It's there in the book of Revelation. The Apostle John, he had this vision of this new heaven and this new earth. And you know, there's lots of folks, they think our faith, it all began with Jesus and the disciples, or maybe it began with Paul and the apostles. But I think if Paul were here today, Paul would advise us that our faith, it actually began with a guy named Abraham. And the fact that we learned last year as we went through this whole journey through the story, for those of you who were here with us then, that when sin sort of messed up everything there in the garden, that really the whole point of that garden is that God wanted to create this place where he could come down and do life with us. But when that plan went kaput, God came up with a plan B. He chose a special people. Our faith began with a covenant with a man named Abraham and with his descendants who became the people of Israel. And that later this guy named Moses, he sealed that covenant, as we heard today, with the blood of an animal. In fact, he sprinkled half of that blood on the altar, and the other half, get this, he sprinkled on the people. How would you like that? As a sign that God would be faithful to them, and they were to be obedient to him. Well, as we'll celebrate next week, being as how it'll be the first Sunday of the month, Jesus would reaffirm that covenant at the Last Supper. He said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." And friends, I think the intention is obvious, that the Christian faith is to be understood as a continuation of the covenant relationship that we have between God and ourselves. He still wants to do life with us. In fact, the writer of the book of Hebrews we heard for this morning even summed it up. He said, if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who were ceremonially unclean, way back in the Old Testament, if that sanctified them so that they are outwardly clean, then how much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, how will it then cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? Now, I know it might be a little difficult for a lot of us to connect with some of the ancient Old Testament imagery. I mean, animal sacrifice, gross. Blood sprinkled on us, primitive, sanctified, purified, dead works. You know, what does all this mean? Well, first of all, I think it means that God is proactive. You may recall business guru Stephen Covey. You know, he wrote that famous book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He came up with that word proactive as a good way to describe one of those 7 habits. And I think it's a good word. It means you don't sit around sort of waiting for life to come to you. You have to take the initiative. He said, you know, losers simply react to life while winners are proactive. That's what he said. So God is proactive. No, he doesn't wait on us to come to him. He comes to us. Well, let's think of, you know, some of the more prevalent images that we often think of when we think of Jesus. We think of the Good Shepherd, you know, with that lost sheep, you know, the 99 that we sang about, that one lost sheep that he goes and finds and he puts it over his shoulder and he brings it back home again. That's one of the ones. Or how about Jesus standing patiently? Remember the painting? He's standing, he's knocking on the door, and he's waiting for somebody on the other side of the door to open the door because there's no doorknob on this side of the door. No, God doesn't wait for us to come penitently, you know, with our hat in our hand, waiting and seeking for forgiveness. God, he takes the initiative. God came looking for Adam and Eve there in the garden. He comes looking for us. You know, some of you may remember the Galloping Gourmet. Remember Graham Kerr? Remember he had this TV cooking program on TV, and he was all rich and he was all famous, and you know, we all can be very envious of that. But what we don't realize is that he had this private agony that he had to endure. It seems his wife Trina was hooked on Valium. She was so addicted to it that the doctor said she should be put away in a mental institution. But there was one person that was aware of what was going on, and it was their maid. Her name was Ruthie. And Ruthie, she got her church to start praying for Trina. And when she did, all of the doctors and all of the therapy that Trina was undergoing wasn't doing a bit of good, but Ruthie knew that it was God that was the solution in her life. So she had her church praying. And one day, Ruthie was in this desperate state, and when she was, Ruthie came and said to Trina, I have a solution, and that solution is Jesus. And Trina responded very negatively. She said, how can God help me with my problems? And yet the very next week, Trina went to church with Ruthie. And there in her church, she experienced this very powerful thing. And she repented. And she gave her life to Jesus. And the people of that church, they began to work with her. And as a result, Trina started reading her Bible. And she threw away her drugs, and she didn't even have any kind of withdrawal. And she began to experience in a very profound way a regaining of her emotional balance. She found peace. She found forgiveness in her life. In fact, the doctor who had treated Trina called her restoration a miracle. And you know, I wonder, was it Trina reaching out to God? Or was it the other way around? And you know what? I think like so many, what Trina needed to know was that God had always loved her. She didn't need to come seeking God because God was already seeking her. She needed to do what we just talked about. She needed to know that knocking that was at the door, that was God. And where was that knocking coming from? God was working through the life of her maid, Ruthie. And from that experience, is that unusual when we think about it, that God will use whatever tool is at hand to get through to us? God is proactive. He takes the initiative. He comes to where we are. Sort of like the song that we were just singing a while ago that we heard for the second time this week. It's called Reckless Love. And we sang the words, "Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. It chases me down. It fights till I'm found. There's no shadow you won't light up, no mountain you won't climb up coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down or lie you won't tear down as you're coming after me." And that brings us to another truth, folks. God is not only proactive, not reactive. Not only does he chase us down and pursue us as he sends his Son to where we are, not only did this God become incarnate and put on flesh and become one of us, but today's lesson, it tells us why this had to be. Because our sin, folks, it doesn't cancel out this covenant that God made so long ago with Abraham. That's where the cross comes in. That we don't have to anymore keep this perfect law that the folks in the Old Testament thought that they had to keep up. We don't have to make this endless procession of these blood sacrifices to be made acceptable before God. And why? Because in Jesus and his death upon the cross, this once and for all sacrifice, it was made on our behalf. It fulfilled the covenant. That's what sanctification means. That though your sins may be as scarlet, they will be made as white as snow. And not because of anything that we have done, but because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. It's like the writer of the book of Hebrews this morning. The writers of the New Testament, they tried to use so many different images to help us to understand. And one of the images I think that best connects with our modern understanding is what John described in his first letter in the book of 1 John in chapter 2. Let's listen to what John tells us. He says, "My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one." We've done wrong. But we have this advocate, this lawyer, who is arguing on our behalf. And you know, folks, I present this image of the advocate with a bit of trepidation because, our culture, we form such a negative image when we think about lawyers. We think of this sort of tricky, slicky kind of a person. I was reading a while back in the Smithsonian magazine about a guy named William Howe. Seems he was the defender of the underworld in the rowdy post-Civil War New York days. Howe was this enormous, lion-headed sort of a guy. He had this wardrobe of costumes that he would put on when he went into the courtroom, and not only that, but he knew how to turn on the tears whenever he came before a jury. It said that on one occasion, he even delivered a 2-hour summation to the jury. He knelt before that jury. On another occasion, he commanded this jury to believe that his client's trigger finger slipped not once, but 6 times. Bang, 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 bang. How could your finger slip 6 times? But he convinced the jury. So many of his clients were thieves that his office safe contained nothing of value. So many of his clients were forgers that his office accepted only cash. This guy, he dealt with murderers. He stood in the courtroom for over 650 murderers. He invented the term temporary insanity. He kept a stable of white-haired old ladies and distraught wives and cherub-faced children, all on the payroll, available to represent the family of the accused. William Howe was the classic unethical lawyer that gives all attorneys a bad name. But then I think about when I was 21 years old, and I had a chance to go to Israel with 30 other college students and study there for a semester. And while I was there, one day, we had the opportunity to go to Jesus' hometown in Nazareth and to spend the night. And this group of Arab Christians, they housed us for the night. My roommate and I, we stayed with this dear man and his wife, and I found out that he was the lawyer of the town. And they called him advocate. That's what they call a lawyer in that culture, like in the old terminology. And I learned by spending those couple of days with this dear man and his wife and how they treated us, it totally changed my view of what a lawyer is because of their kindness. Maybe that's why I relate so well to what John says to us. Jesus, he's our advocate, our attorney. And if anybody needs a lawyer, a good one, standing before a holy God and judge, folks, it's you and I. We don't need some tricky, slicky attorney like William Howe. What we need is a lawyer who is impeccable, a person of integrity, who's totally believable. And when they say my client is not accountable for their wrongdoings, it's believed. And all of heaven and all of earth knows this to be true. And why? Why are Jesus' clients, you and I, not accountable? Because Christ himself has already paid the penalty. And that may sound like a bunch of old, antiquated imagery, but here's why it's important. There are so many sitting here today who do not believe that perhaps you are worthy of the love of Jesus Christ. Pastor, I've done wrong in my past. How could God ever love me? I've been unfaithful to my spouse. My alcoholism, it's hurt so many other people. I'm living the secret double life that no one knows about. If only they knew. Yeah, how could a good and perfect God love me? And yet that's the whole point of the covenant. That God is as committed to us as a spouse is committed to their lover. For better, for worse, for richer, for poor. This covenant relationship, it can't be broken. Neither sin nor death can take it away. God is a proactive God. And even our sin can't cancel out this covenant. And yet there's one more element to this covenant that we need to discuss this morning, and it's our response. Dear ones, when we open ourselves up to God's unmerited grace, our natural response then becomes obedience. Sin, it can't cancel out this relationship with God. But you know what? It also doesn't allow our relationship with God, sin can't, to ever satisfy our deepest needs. But when we decide in our response to do our part in fulfilling this relationship, in our obedience to God, this becomes the natural response to grace. I remember back in the summer of 93, and Cindy and I, we went to a church conference out in St. Louis. And if you remember that summer, that was the summer of a great flood. And these torrential rains, they made rivers like the Mississippi and the Missouri overflood their banks into the farmland, into the surrounding communities. And remember the view as our plane came down and got lower and was heading into St. Louis. And for miles, all you could see was water, water, water. And while we were at that church conference, the conference just sort of stopped. And the people, they began to pack sandbags to stem the tide of this monster flood. And yet what I remember the most amidst all of those heroic efforts, it was the story of this group of convicts. And they were conscripted into flood duty, taken from this prison in Greene County, Illinois. So there they were, and they were packing these sandbags at this levee, and if they failed, this little town called Enoda on the Iowa-Illinois border was going to be wiped out. And so amazingly, these criminals, they worked feverishly to save this town. They wouldn't eat, they wouldn't sleep, they kept packing those sandbags until that levee, it gave way, and that little town of 200 homes, it was destroyed. And the convicts' response, they openly wept. And you may wonder, why did they suddenly become good Samaritans? Well, it seems that after dealing in drugs and violence and destruction for all of their lives, that they now had this positive purpose in their life. They had this mission to save this town. Something noble, something bigger than themselves. And what a superb analogy of God's grace working in people's lives. And I'll tell you, if they would have been in a position to do so, I think the authorities, they might have said, now let's just wait. Let's wait until these convicts sort of clean up their lives before we give them something to do. And yet circumstances, it forced them that they had to use these convicts and put them to where they were needed. And what do you know? Something good and noble happened in the hearts of those wretched men. You know what? I think that's God's approach to us. God has already paid the price for our sin in advance. He didn't wait till we had somehow reformed ourselves before he did it. It's like the Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Romans. He said, but God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And we might think that that's sort of a foolhardy thing. But God knows that within each of us is something noble. Remember, he made us in his image. He didn't wait till we had fixed ourselves. He was proactive. Yeah, even our most despicable sins didn't keep God's reckless love from finding us. Like today's lesson, Christ's blood has been sprinkled all over us. The price has been paid. And our response to that covenantal love, it's obedience. You know, as we wrap up, the Kellogg's Cereal Company, they found out a while back that the Kellogg's Corn Flakes, old standard of the industry, it was sagging a bit. So they launched this whole ad campaign in which people were told to taste them as if for the very first time. And you know what, folks, as we begin a summer of rather ordinary Sundays, in fact, they even call this season in the life of the church ordinary time. This time of the year, it can become a time in which we become a bit blasé about our faith. You know, we become bored, our faith dries out, it becomes old, it becomes stale. Yeah, vacation Bible school, been there. Ho-hum. Kids Coalition Against Hunger, done that. Old news. But in our covenant relationship with Christ, if yours has become a bit stale, maybe it's time for you to get to know Jesus all over again, as if for the very first time. To rededicate your life to him. And I don't know, maybe a fresh dunk in the cold waters of Lake Michigan next weekend would be just the ticket to wake us up and to remind us of how precious that covenant is. Would you pray with me? Father God, no, we don't understand all this high, fancy, falutin theology from the Old Testament. But what we can understand is this overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of a God that pursues us, who loves us, who is proactive, who comes to where we are in all of our inadequacy. How can we ever take that for granted? Renew us. Wake us up that we might worship you and serve you with passion as if for the very first time.